December 24th, 1944. The Ardennes forest. American soldiers are surrounded, cut off from their lines, facing certain death or capture. German troops are closing in from every direction. And then something impossible happens. A woman opens her cabin door in the middle of a snowstorm and does something that will change all of their lives forever. This is not the Christmas truce you've heard about. This is not 1914. This is the Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive, where 170,000 German soldiers crashed through American lines in one of the bloodiest battles the United States Army would fight in the entire war. The stakes could not be higher, the hatred could not be deeper, and yet for one night in a tiny cabin deep in the forest, enemies became something else entirely. What happened in that cabin has been verified by multiple witnesses, documented by historians, and stands as one of the most extraordinary moments of human decency in the midst of total war. Stay with me, because the way this night unfolds will challenge everything you think you know about war, about enemies, and about what's possible when human beings choose compassion over conflict. And I promise you, the moment when these soldiers first see each other across that cabin threshold will give you chills. To understand what made this night so impossible, so miraculous, you need to understand where these men had been just hours before. You need to feel the weight of what was happening in the Ardennes forest in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16th with a German offensive so massive, so unexpected, that it threw the entire Allied advance into chaos. Hitler had gambled everything on one last attack, sending his best remaining divisions crashing through the weakest point in the American lines. The goal was audacious: split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West so Germany could focus all its strength against the Soviets in the East. For the American soldiers caught in the initial assault, it was hell. Entire units were surrounded. Communications broke down. In the snow and fog, men couldn't tell where the front lines were anymore. Villages that had been secure yesterday were behind enemy lines today. And the weather was brutally cold, with snow falling so heavily that neither side could get air support. Men were freezing in foxholes. Artillery was pounding constantly, and everywhere there was confusion, fear, and death. 3 American soldiers were lost in this chaos. Their names were James Rasper, Ralph Blank, and Lester Schmenck. They were separated from their unit, somewhere deep in the Belgian forest near the German border, trying desperately to find their way back to American lines. But with German troops everywhere, with the snow making it nearly impossible to navigate, and with darkness falling on Christmas Eve, their chances of survival were dropping by the minute. Now here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn, and I need you to stay with me because this is where it gets interesting. In the middle of this frozen battlefield stood a small hunting cabin. It was isolated, primitive, heated only by a wood stove. And inside that cabin was a German woman named Elisabeth Winken and her 12-year-old son Fritz. Elizabeth's story is crucial here. She wasn't supposed to be in this cabin. She had fled Aachen, a German city that had been destroyed by Allied bombing and ground fighting just months earlier. Her husband was away, serving somewhere in the German army. She had taken Fritz to this remote cabin to escape the war, to find somewhere, anywhere that might be safe. She had a small amount of food she'd been saving, some potatoes, a rooster she'd been planning to cook for Christmas dinner, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, they could have one peaceful holiday despite everything happening around them. On the afternoon of Christmas Eve, Elizabeth was preparing that Christmas dinner when she heard a knock at the door. Think about that for a moment. A knock on the door in the middle of a battle zone, in the middle of nowhere, on Christmas Eve. Who could it possibly be? She opened the door to find 3 American soldiers, frozen, exhausted, one of them wounded. They had seen smoke from the chimney and stumbled toward it, desperate for shelter from the cold and the fighting. One of the Americans, Harry Rasper's friend, who served as their medic, tried to explain their situation in broken German. They were lost. They were freezing. One of their companions had been hit by shrapnel. Could they please come inside? Elizabeth faced an impossible choice in that moment, and this is where you need to understand the stakes. She was a German civilian. These were enemy soldiers. If German troops found her harboring Americans, the consequences could be severe. Her own countrymen could execute her as a traitor. Her son could be endangered. And yet, looking at these frozen, desperate young men, she made a decision that would have seemed insane to almost anyone else in Europe at that moment. She invited them in. She told them to put down their weapons by the door. She sat the wounded soldier by the stove and began to assess his injuries. And then she said something that, according to Fritz's later account, would prove prophetic. There will be no shooting here tonight. This is Christmas Eve. But the night was about to get much more complicated because the war was not done with this cabin yet. Elizabeth had just gotten the Americans settled, had just started to relax slightly, when there was another knock at the door. The Americans froze. They reached instinctively for their weapons. Elizabeth held up her hand and went to the door. Standing outside were 4 German soldiers. Wehrmacht troops, cold and lost, just like the Americans. They had also seen the smoke from the chimney. They were also desperate for shelter, and one of them was also wounded, suffering from severe frostbite. Here's the moment that will give you chills. Elizabeth stepped outside, closing the door behind her, and had a conversation with these German soldiers before letting them in. According to Fritz's account years later, she told them there were already guests in the cabin. She told them those guests were Americans. And then she said something remarkable. You can all celebrate Christmas together, or you can go back out into the cold and kill each other. Which will it be? The German soldiers, as shocked as you might imagine, agreed to her terms. They would leave their weapons outside. There would be no fighting, no hostility, not tonight. Elizabeth opened the door and gestured for them to enter. And now, inside this tiny cabin in the middle of the Ardennes forest, in the middle of the bloodiest battle in American military history, 7 enemy soldiers stood face to face. The tension in that cabin must have been extraordinary. These were not symbolic enemies. These were men who, hours earlier, had been trying to kill people wearing the other side's uniform. The Americans had watched their friends die at German hands. The Germans had seen their cities bombed, their country invaded. The propaganda each side had been fed about the other painted the enemy as monsters, as subhuman, as worthy only of destruction. And yet Elizabeth Vinken had created a space where none of that could matter. Her rules were absolute: no weapons, no fighting, and perhaps most importantly, everyone would help with dinner. What happened next has been corroborated by multiple accounts, and it reveals something profound about human nature. The German soldier who spoke the best English began to translate. Slowly, carefully, the men began to communicate. The German medic, who had actual medical training, examined the wounded American and determined that the shrapnel wound was serious but not life-threatening. He cleaned and dressed the wound properly, far better than the Americans had been able to do in the field. Meanwhile, Elizabeth put everyone to work. The Americans peeled potatoes, the Germans prepared the rooster, there was wood to be chopped for the stove, the cabin needed to stay warm, and gradually, as men worked side by side on mundane tasks, something remarkable began to happen. The immediate threat level dropped. Shoulders relaxed slightly. Someone made a joke, which was translated, which got a careful laugh. Fritz Vinchen later recalled watching these men and being amazed at how young they all were. In uniform, in combat, soldiers become representatives of nations, of ideologies, of military machines. But stripped of that context, working together to prepare a meal, they were just young men far from home, scared and tired and desperate to survive. The dinner itself became a kind of communion. Elizabeth had very little food, but she made it stretch. There were potatoes, the rooster divided among too many people, some bread. It was not a feast by any measure, but it was shared equally, with Germans and Americans eating from the same small portions, passing food around that tiny table in a cabin barely large enough to hold them all. And here's a detail that historians have confirmed through multiple sources. They sang. Someone started a Christmas carol. The Germans knew different words but the same melody. O Tannenbaum became O Christmas Tree. Stille Nacht became Silent Night. Music, that universal language, created a bridge that propaganda could not destroy. But the question hanging over everything was, what happens when morning comes? What happens when the spell of Christmas Eve breaks and they have to return to being enemies again? None of the men slept easily that night. The cabin was crowded, and despite the temporary peace, there was an underlying tension that never fully disappeared. These were still enemies, still technically at war, still capable of betraying each other the moment circumstances changed. The German soldiers knew American positions now. The Americans knew German positions. When they left this cabin, that information could cost lives on both sides. As dawn broke on Christmas morning, the reality of their situation became unavoidable. They had to leave. The Americans needed to find their way back to their lines. The Germans needed to rejoin their unit. And both groups faced serious danger in doing so. What happened next speaks to something profound about the human capacity for honor, even in the midst of the most dishonorable circumstances. The German soldiers, particularly the one who spoke English, began to draw a map. They showed the Americans where the German positions were. They explained which routes would be safest, which areas to avoid. This was intelligence that could have gotten them executed for treason, and yet they gave it freely, understanding that these particular Americans, the ones they had shared Christmas Eve with, deserved to survive. The Americans, in turn, shared what they knew about American positions, helping the Germans understand how to navigate back to their lines without stumbling into an American patrol. It was a mutual exchange of survival, a recognition that whatever happened in the wider war, these specific individuals had formed a bond that transcended the conflict. Elizabeth Vinken prepared what little food remained for them to take. She divided it equally, gave them directions as best she could, and then she made them all promise something. She made them promise that when they told this story, if they told this story, they would remember that humanity persisted even here, even in the darkest moments of the war. The soldiers left in separate directions, the Americans heading west, the Germans heading east. They did not exchange names or addresses. The risk was too great. If either side was captured and interrogated, knowing nothing protected everyone. And so they parted as they had met, as strangers who, for one impossible night, had chosen to be something other than enemies. For decades, this story remained virtually unknown. None of the soldiers involved spoke about it publicly, and when you understand the context, you understand why. 1944 was different from 1914. The Christmas truce of World War I had become famous precisely because it was spontaneous, widespread, and happened early in the war when the reasons for fighting still seemed murky to many soldiers. But by 1944, after the Holocaust, after years of total war, after so much death and destruction, fraternizing with the enemy was not seen as a heartwarming story. It was seen as suspect, possibly even treasonous. The Americans who survived that night went back to fighting. The Battle of the Bulge continued with horrific casualties for weeks. By the time it ended in late January 1945, nearly 20,000 Americans had been killed and over 60,000 wounded. The Germans lost even more. It was brutal, desperate fighting. And any soldier who talked about sharing Christmas dinner with the enemy would have faced serious questions about their loyalty and judgment. The German soldiers faced even greater pressure to remain silent. Germany lost the war, was occupied, divided, and spent years reckoning with the crimes of the Nazi regime. A German veteran talking about a moment of humanity with American soldiers might be dismissed as attempting to whitewash the war, to create a false equivalency between Allied and Axis forces, to suggest that there were good Germans fighting an unjust war. The political complications were immense. Elizabeth Vinken and her son Fritz returned to Germany after the war, tried to rebuild their lives in a destroyed country, and rarely spoke about that Christmas Eve. It was too complicated, too difficult to explain, too likely to be misunderstood. And so the story might have died with them, lost to history, just another untold moment in a war filled with millions of untold moments. Except for one chance encounter. In 1995, 50 years after that Christmas Eve, a German journalist was researching stories about civilians caught in the Battle of the Bulge. He came across a brief mention in an old interview of a woman who had sheltered soldiers during the battle. The details were vague, but something about the story intrigued him. He began investigating, tracking down records, looking for anyone who might know more. He found Fritz Vinken, now an elderly man living in Hawaii. Fritz had rarely told the story of that night, but 50 years of distance had given him perspective. He understood now that what his mother had done was not just remarkable, but historically significant. He agreed to go on record with the full account. At roughly the same time, one of the American soldiers involved had also begun to speak about that night. Ralph Blank had kept silent for decades, but in his later years, he felt compelled to tell his children and grandchildren about the Christmas Eve when enemies became dinner guests. His account matched Fritz's in every essential detail. Historians began to investigate seriously. They cross-referenced military records, tracked down the other soldiers involved, and confirmed that yes, this had actually happened. The details matched, the timeline worked, and the story that emerged was even more remarkable than the brief account suggested. What made this story credible to historians was precisely its complexity. If someone were inventing a feel-good Christmas story, they would have made it simpler, more dramatic, with tearful farewells and promises of eternal friendship. But the real story was messy, tense, filled with fear and uncertainty, and ended with a practical exchange of military intelligence and a quiet parting. That's what real life looks like, even in extraordinary circumstances. The story was eventually published and caused a sensation, particularly in Germany and the United States. It appeared in Reader's Digest, was featured in documentaries, and became a touchstone for discussions about the humanity that can persist even in war. Fritz Winken became something of a spokesperson for the story, giving interviews and emphasizing his mother's courage and moral clarity in that moment. So why does this story resonate so powerfully? Why, out of all the millions of stories from World War II, does this particular Christmas Eve matter? I think it matters because it complicates our understanding of war in necessary ways. War requires us to think in collectives, to see the enemy as a monolithic force rather than as individuals. We talk about the Germans, the Americans, the Allies, the Axis. We need these categories to make sense of massive, complex conflicts. But these categories also obscure a fundamental truth. Wars are fought by human beings who, in different circumstances, might have been friends rather than enemies. Elizabeth Vincent understood this instinctively. She looked at those soldiers, American and German alike, and saw not uniforms or flags, but young men far from home who needed help. Her maternal instinct, her basic human decency, overrode every other consideration, and by creating a space where those young men could not be enemies, where they had to be simply human beings sharing a meal, she gave them permission to recognize each other's humanity. This is not a story about both sides being equally right or equally wrong. The moral questions of World War II are not ambiguous. The Nazi regime was objectively evil, and stopping it was a moral imperative. But this story reminds us that even in a just war, even when fighting genuine evil, the individual soldiers on both sides remain human beings capable of decency, mercy, and compassion. The story also matters because it demonstrates the power of simple moral courage. Elizabeth Vinken was not a political leader, not a military commander, not someone with institutional power. She was a civilian trying to survive, trying to protect her son, and yet she created peace in her small corner of the war through nothing more than force of will and moral clarity. She established rules, no weapons, no fighting, and enforced them through the sheer power of maternal authority. And these combat soldiers, these men trained to kill, followed her rules because something in them wanted to believe that peace was possible, even if just for one night. Now, I want to be clear about something, because historical accuracy matters, and I don't want to overstate what this story represents. This was not typical. This was not how the Battle of the Bulge generally proceeded. The vast majority of soldiers on both sides never experienced anything like this. They fought, they suffered, they killed and died without any moments of shared humanity with the enemy. The Battle of the Bulge saw some of the worst atrocities committed by both sides during the war in Western Europe. The Malmedy Massacre, where German SS troops executed American prisoners of war, happened during this same offensive. American troops, enraged by reports of German atrocities, sometimes shot German prisoners in retaliation. The rules of war, never strong, broke down further under the pressure of desperate combat in winter conditions. So we cannot romanticize this story or pretend it represents something larger than it was. It was one cabin, one night, a handful of soldiers out of the hundreds of thousands fighting in the Ardennes. It was an exception, not a rule, but exceptions matter. Exceptions show us what human beings are capable of, even in the worst circumstances. They provide a counter-narrative to the idea that war inevitably reduces people to their worst selves, that violence always begets more violence, that enemies can never be anything other than enemies. What can we learn from this story that applies beyond World War II, beyond that specific time and place? Several things, I think, and they're worth considering carefully. First, the power of a moral authority figure cannot be underestimated. Elizabeth Vinken had no weapons, no military rank, no legal authority over those soldiers. But she had moral clarity and the courage to enforce it. She created rules for her space and made clear that anyone who violated those rules would face consequences, even if those consequences were simply being asked to leave. The soldiers respected her authority because, on some level, they wanted someone to give them permission to stop fighting, even temporarily. Second, shared tasks create shared humanity. The act of preparing dinner together, of working toward a common goal, began to break down the barriers between these men. This is a principle that applies far beyond warfare. When people work together towards shared objectives, when they depend on each other for survival or success, it becomes much harder to dehumanize them. Third, timing matters. This was Christmas Eve, a moment heavy with cultural and religious significance for most of the soldiers involved. The holiday gave them a framework for understanding what was happening, a narrative of peace and goodwill that they could invoke to make sense of their temporary truce. Would this have happened on an ordinary night in November? Possibly not. The cultural moment created space for something extraordinary. Fourth, silence can protect memory as much as it erases it. These soldiers kept this story quiet for decades, but they remembered it. They carried it with them. And when the time was right, when the context allowed, they shared it. Not everything needs to be spoken immediately. Sometimes wisdom lies in knowing when a story can be told effectively and when it needs to wait. Elizabeth Vinken died in 1993, just 2 years before her story became widely known. She never saw it celebrated, never knew that what she did would be remembered and honored decades later. Fritz Vinchen spent the last years of his life trying to honor his mother's memory by telling this story accurately and thoughtfully, resisting attempts to sentimentalize or oversimplify it. The soldiers involved have all passed away now. The last survivor died in the early 2000s. The cabin where this happened no longer stands. The forest has grown over the scars of battle. The Ardennes is peaceful now, a popular hiking destination, beautiful and serene. But the story persists. It persists because it offers something we desperately need, evidence that even in our worst moments, even in the midst of total war, human decency remains possible. We can choose compassion over conflict. We can see the humanity in our enemies. We can create spaces, however temporary, where peace prevails. This is not a naive or sentimental conclusion. The men in that cabin went back to war. Some of them probably killed enemy soldiers in the days and weeks that followed. The war did not end because of one shared Christmas dinner. Evil was not defeated by kindness alone. The Nazi regime had to be destroyed by force, and that destruction cost millions of lives. But within that larger story of necessary violence, this smaller story of unnecessary peace matters. It matters because it shows us who we can be, even when circumstances push us toward our worst selves. It matters because Elizabeth Vinken proved that individual moral courage can create change, even in the smallest ways. It matters because those soldiers, American and German alike, proved that orders and propaganda and uniforms cannot completely erase our common humanity. The Christmas Eve truce of 1944 did not change the outcome of the war. It did not save thousands of lives or alter the course of history, but it changed the lives of the men who experienced it, gave them a story they carried for decades, gave them evidence that even in hell, moments of grace remain possible. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps small miracles, moments of unexpected humanity, brief truces in the midst of conflict. Perhaps these are what ultimately redeem us. Not by ending war, but by reminding us that war is not all we are, that our capacity for destruction is matched by our capacity for decency, and that even in our darkest hours, we remain capable of choosing mercy over violence. If this story moved you, if it gave you something to think about, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. There are countless stories like this in history, Moments where individual human beings made choices that challenged the narratives of their time, that showed us who we can be at our best. I'll be here to explore more of them with you. The cabin in the Ardennes is gone. The soldiers are gone. Elizabeth Vinken is gone. But the choice she made that Christmas Eve remains, echoing through time, reminding us that peace is always possible if we have the courage to choose it, even if just for one night, even if just in one small cabin in the midst of war.